Stanford University had seen its fair share of debates, but this one was different. It wasn't a formal debate with podiums, judges, or a neatly prepared script. It was a battle of wits, convictions, and ideas. And at the center of it all stood Professor Daniel Warren, renowned for his razor-sharp arguments against religion. The lecture hall was packed, with students eager to watch another one of his infamous discussions. Some came to challenge him, others to take notes for their philosophy exams, and a few just to enjoy the spectacle of a seasoned professor dismantling faith with cold logic. But today, something unexpected happened. A quiet student, known to keep to himself, changed the course of the debate in a way that no one anticipated. The setup, a skeptic's playground. Professor Warren was in his element. He had spent years crafting his arguments, refining his ability to trap unsuspecting students in logical contradictions. Religion, he said, pacing the front of the room, is a relic of the past. We live in an age of science, reason, and logic, yet people still believe in an invisible deity that controls everything. A few chuckles rippled through the room. He had given this speech dozens of times, and the reactions were always the same: laughter from skeptics, nervous silence from believers. But here's the real question, he continued, his voice thick with confidence. If the so-called loving God exists, why do bad things happen? He let the question hang in the air, looking around the room. Most students avoided his gaze, knowing better than to become his next target. But then, his eyes landed on one student near the back, Barron. When an atheist professor met his match, unlike most students who either shrank in their seats or stumbled over their words, Barron didn't flinch. His expression remained calm, his gaze unwavering. Warren smirked. He enjoyed a challenge. "You're a believer, aren't you?" he asked, his voice laced with mock curiosity. Barron nodded. "I am." "Fascinating," Warren said, leaning against the podium. "Maybe you can help me understand something. If Jesus is real, why do bad things happen? Why doesn't he step in and fix everything?" The room fell silent, waiting for Barron to crumble under pressure. But instead of scrambling for an answer, Barron simply leaned forward, resting his arms on his desk. "I think you're asking the wrong question," he said evenly. The smirk on Warren's face flickered, just for a second. He wasn't expecting that response. Professor Smug's smile fades fast. Warren tilted his head. "Oh, enlighten me." Barron didn't react to the sarcasm. He took a slow breath, then spoke. "You keep asking why God lets bad things happen, but let's be real. What you're really asking is why he doesn't stop them. Why doesn't he step in and take controls?" Warren clapped his hands together. "Exactly. Now we're getting somewhere." He pointed at Barron. "Let's say I'm standing on train tracks and a train is coming straight at me. You see me, and you have the power to stop it, but you don't. What does that make you?" Barron tilted his head. "Are you saying we're all tied to train tracks?" More laughter. Warren smirked again, thinking he had him cornered. But Barron continued. "You're using a loaded example. If someone is about to get hit by a train, stopping them is clearly the right choice because they're powerless to stop it themselves. But life isn't that simple, is it?" The laughter faded. Barron's voice remained calm. "People have free will. If God intervened in everything, we wouldn't have free will. We'd be puppets." Warren scoffed, shaking his head. "Ah, free will, the classic escape route." A few students laughed again, but not as many as before. "Okay, let's follow that logic," Warren said, pacing again. "If a child gets sick and dies, is that just free will? If a man loses his wife in an accident, should he just shrug and say, 'Oh well, God didn't want to interfere'?" Barron exhaled, as if he had expected that argument. "That's not what I said," he replied. "You're mixing up human choices with suffering. Some things happen because of people's decisions, violence, injustice, greed. Other things, like illness or accidents, remind us that life is fragile." Warren pounced. "Exactly, fragile. Random. Chaotic. just like the universe. No divine plan, just chance. Barron shook his head. No, just because life has suffering doesn't mean it has no meaning. The class was quieter now. Even students who had laughed earlier were listening more carefully. The question that stopped the mockery. Barron leaned forward slightly. You keep asking why God doesn't stop bad things, but let's flip the question. Why does anything good happen at all? Warren blinked. Barron continued. Why do people love? Why do they forgive? Why do they sacrifice for others? If the world is just chaos, why do we fight for something better? Warren opened his mouth to respond, but paused. For the first time in one of his debates, it wasn't just a believer on the defensive. The professor quickly recovered and crossed his arms. You're dodging the point, Barron. You're talking about love and sacrifice as if they prove anything. But those things don't need a God. Humans evolved to care about each other for survival. Altruism is just a biological function. Barron studied him for a moment, then nodded. All right, let's test that idea. The room was silent. Barron continued. Let's say you're right. Everything we feel, love, kindness, selflessness, it's just chemicals in our brains, something evolution wired into us. So what happens when someone decides to ignore that wiring? When they choose to be selfish? When they hurt others just because they can? Warren smirked again. Then we call them immoral. But why? Barron asked. If everything is just random chance, if there's no higher meaning, what makes one action right and another wrong? If morality is just something we invented, then a person who kills for fun is no different from a person who feeds the hungry. They're both just following their instincts, right? A few students frowned. The debate had taken an unexpected turn. Warren scoffed. That's a false comparison. Societies create morality because it benefits the group. We punish murder because it destabilizes the community. Barron nodded. So, morality is just whatever works for the majority. Warren shrugged. More or less. Barron let the words hang in the air. Then he asked, was slavery moral when the majority supported it? The classroom went completely silent. Faith versus logic. A showdown like no other. Warren's expression hardened. That's not what I said. But it's what your argument suggests, Barron replied. If morality is just decided by the majority, then slavery, segregation, and genocide were all right at some point in history, just because most people accepted them. Is that what you believe? A few students shifted in their seats. Even those who weren't religious seemed uncomfortable with Warren's position now. The professor exhaled, shaking his head. You're twisting my words. Morality evolves as societies grow more enlightened. Barron nodded. And what makes that progression possible? If right and wrong are just human-made ideas, why do we instinctively feel that some things are wrong, no matter how many people accept them? Warren opened his mouth, then shut it again. Barron's voice remained steady. We recognize evil not because society tells us to, but because there's something in us that knows. Something deeper than culture or biology. The room was dead silent now. For the first time in years, Professor Warren didn't have a comeback. And that silence said more than any argument ever could. Professor Warren had spent years crafting his arguments. He knew exactly how to dismantle religious beliefs with surgical precision. Yet, as he stared at Barron, he could sense that this student wasn't like the others. Let's take this a step further, Warren said, pacing in front of the lecture hall. You're saying suffering exists because of free will. Fine, but what about disasters? What about earthquakes, hurricanes, cancer? Those aren't choices. That's suffering forced upon people. If your God is real, why doesn't he stop those? A murmur rippled through the room. It was the unspoken question that lurked in the minds of believers and skeptics alike. Barron nodded. That's a fair question. He leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. Have you ever lost someone, Professor? Warren blinked, clearly not expecting the question. He hesitated for just a fraction of a second before answering. Everyone loses someone at some point. It's part of life. Barron studied him. And did that loss change you? Warren frowned. What are you getting at? I mean, did it make you see things differently? Did it make you appreciate life more? Did it change your perspective? Warren remained silent. Barron continued, his voice measured. Suffering isn't meaningless just because we don't like it. Hard times force us to see what truly matters. They push us to grow, to love deeper, to appreciate time. If God stopped all suffering, we wouldn't learn these things. The room was silent, save for the distant hum of the air conditioning. Even the skeptics seemed to be weighing his words. Is morality just an illusion? Warren shook his head, regaining his composure. That's a nice sentiment, he said. But you're still dancing around the issue. People suffer horribly, and yet you still believe in an all-loving God. Barron exhaled. Yes. Warren folded his arms. Let's test that belief. You claim that morality, our sense of right and wrong, comes from God. But I argue that morality is just a human construct. Societies decide what's acceptable. We don't need a God for that. Barron leaned back in his chair. So you believe morality is whatever society says it is? More or less, Warren replied. Morality evolves as we progress. Barron nodded. Then was slavery moral when most societies accepted it? Warren's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Barron pressed on. Was segregation moral? Were genocides justified when the majority approved them? A few students shifted in their seats. Warren finally spoke. Of course not. Those were mistakes of the past. Barron tilted his head. Then by your logic, morality is fluid. What we call evil today could be acceptable in the future, and vice versa. That's a terrifying thought. A hush fell over the room. The weight of Barron's words settled like a thick fog. Warren clenched his jaw. We progress as a society. That's how morality works. Barron smiled slightly. But progress toward what? If there's no higher moral law, no fixed standard, then how do we know we're actually improving? How do we know we aren't just shifting opinions? More silence. This student's reply to atheism will give you chills. A student near the front row, Jessica, raised her hand hesitantly. Warren turned to her, grateful for a moment to regain control of the discussion. Go ahead, he said. Jessica glanced at Barron. You keep saying that morality comes from God, but what about people who don't believe in God and still do good? Atheists can be kind, compassionate, and moral. Doesn't that prove that we don't need religion to be good? Barron nodded. That's a great question. He took a deep breath before responding. Imagine a beautiful painting, a masterpiece. A person might look at it and admire its beauty without knowing the artist. They don't need to see the painter to recognize that it was created with intention. Jessica furrowed her brow. What does that have to do with morality? Barron continued. Atheists can absolutely be moral. They can do good, love others, and fight for justice. But where does that deep sense of right and wrong come from? Just because someone doesn't believe in God doesn't mean he isn't the source of morality. Just like someone who admires a painting doesn't need to know the artist to appreciate the work. Jessica sat back, thoughtful. Warren exhaled sharply. That's a poetic analogy, but it doesn't prove anything. Barron met his gaze. Neither does denying it. The unexpected comeback that shattered a professor's argument. Warren leaned on the podium, clearly growing frustrated. Let's be honest, Barron. You can argue about morality all day, but you still haven't proven that God exists. You're just making philosophical points. Barron exhaled, as if he had been waiting for this. Professor, do you love anyone? Warren blinked. The sudden shift caught him off guard. What? Barron repeated. Do you love anyone? A friend? A family member? The professor hesitated. Of course. Barron nodded. Prove it. A few students murmured, exchanging glances. Warren frowned. That's ridiculous. Love isn't something you can measure in a test tube. Barron leaned forward. Exactly. You believe in love, even though you can't see it, touch it, or quantify it. You believe it because you experience it. Warren stared at him. Barron's voice remained steady. That's exactly why I believe in God. The room was silent. Can science explain love? Barron continued. You can't put love under a microscope, but you know it's real because of how it changes you. That's how I see God. Not as something that can be tested in a lab, but as something that changes lives. He paused, looking around the room. I see God in the mother who forgives the man who killed her son. I see him in the doctor who spends his life saving strangers. I see him in every person who chooses kindness over cruelty, sacrifice over selfishness, love over hate. The air in the room felt different now. The usual rhythm of Warren's debates. Setting the trap, the student fumbling, the professor delivering the final blow, wasn't playing out as expected. For the first time, Warren had no immediate response. Jessica stared at her notebook, her pen frozen in her hand. A student near the back swallowed hard. Another shifted in his seat, arms crossed, his eyes distant in thought. The bell rang, signaling the end of the lecture, but no one moved. The debate that changed everything. Professor Warren glanced at the clock, then back at Barron. He cleared his throat. That's all for today. Still, no one rushed to leave. Some exchanged glances, others sat in silence, lost in thought. Jessica hesitated before closing her notebook. Her expression was unreadable. Barron stood, gathering his books as if nothing had happened. He didn't look like someone who had just shaken the foundation of a man who built his career on challenging faith. Professor Warren watched him but didn't stop him. He didn't throw out one last retort. Instead, he simply said, I'll see you next class. It was subtle, but something in his voice had changed. Barron nodded. See you then, Professor. And with that, he walked out, knowing that he hadn't won anything. That wasn't the point. But he also knew that something had shifted. Maybe for just one student in that room. Maybe even for Professor Warren himself. Because faith isn't about winning arguments. It's about seeing the world differently. And sometimes, all it takes is one conversation to plant the seed. The one question that left an atheist professor speechless. The lecture hall, once filled with the hum of chatter and laughter, now held an eerie stillness. The rhythm of the debate had shifted, and everyone knew it. Professor Warren, the man who had built his reputation on dismantling faith, stood at the front of the room, arms crossed, staring at Barron. It wasn't often that someone left him without a quick rebuttal, but Barron's last statement, comparing belief in God to the experience of love, had done just that. Warren cleared his throat. All right, Barron, you've given some interesting responses, but let's address the bigger question. Barron waited. Warren leaned against the podium. If your God is real, why doesn't he just prove it? Why doesn't he show up right now in this room and silence all doubts? The class perked up. It was the classic challenge. The demand for undeniable, visible proof. Barron smiled slightly. You mean, why doesn't God perform a magic trick on command? A few students chuckled. Warren smirked. Call it what you will. But if he exists, why not make it obvious? Barron exhaled, taking a moment before responding. Professor, do you believe in history? Warren frowned. What? History? Barron repeated. Do you believe George Washington was real? Warren scoffed. Obviously, Barron nodded. But you've never met him. You weren't there to see him cross the Delaware. So how do you know? Warren rolled his eyes. Historical records, eyewitness accounts, written documents. Exactly, Barron interrupted. You trust those sources. And yet, you demand God show up in person as the only acceptable.